Welcome back to Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion. In this segment, we'll be looking at Jewish responses to the problem of evil. Like the Quran, the Hebrew Bible contains various passages dealing with human suffering. But unlike the Quran, the Hebrew Bible also has an entire book devoted to the issue, the Book of Job. This book, and how one of the most influential Jewish philosophers has interpreted it, will be our focus in this segment. But before we get to Job, let's first look at the various ways evil is explained in other books of the Hebrew Bible. When we look at the Hebrew Bible, by far the most dominant explanation for suffering is punishment. And the connection between suffering and punishment is established right from the outset. In the first book, Genesis, if we just stick with that, we find that Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden as punishment for their transgression. We find almost the whole of the human race being killed by a flood as punishment for wickedness. And we're told about the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed as punishment for their iniquity. And in subsequent books, there are many other examples of suffering inflicted as punishment, whether that be of an individual or a group. In one passage, God explains all the things that will be done to those who do not obey the commandments: consumption, fever, crop failure, pestilence, and so on. So that makes it crystal clear, the link between suffering and punishment. But although the Hebrew Bible most commonly explains suffering as punishment, it does offer other explanations for suffering. For example, there are a number of passages which indicate that suffering may be a test. Though note that this is not a test in the sense of a process to discover what something or someone is like, but rather a test that serves to refine and remove impurities. The passages that speak of testing all draw a parallel between the testing of humans and the testing of metals. And they allude to the ancient process of drawing the silver from a metal compound by heating it to a very high temperature. The result of that process is that the silver is drawn off and refined. And we're supposed to think of suffering as a test in this sense, as refining or purifying us in a way analogous to how the testing of metals refines or purifies the silver. Here we should note that whereas suffering as punishment is by definition confined to wrongdoers, suffering as a test is aimed at the righteous, to make them more righteous. And lastly, the Hebrew Bible also contains occasional suggestions that suffering may be pointless. The wicked prosper, the righteous struggle, with no sign of this having been for any purpose. The idea crops up in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we'll also find it throughout the book of Job, to which we now turn. It's pretty easy to give a quick summary of what happens in the book of Job. The central character, Job, is a good person, happy, healthy, with a big family and a lot of wealth. All this changes very quickly, and Job is left broken and destitute. His friends try to explain his sudden change in fortunes, but they don't do a particularly good job of it. Job knows that God is responsible and demands a hearing to plead his case. Eventually, God speaks to Job, praises him, and restores his fortunes. So after a pretty rotten time, all is well that ends well. In case you're wondering, the majority view among Jewish thinkers is that the book of Job is allegorical. In other words, they don't think the events described in the book actually happened, but were instead constructed in order to convey a hidden meaning. Now, the book of Job was written probably in the 6th century before the Common Era. The version in the Hebrew Bible is the canonical book of Job, and we call it canonical because it's part of the canon, the sacred books accepted as genuine. But there are other versions of the story. So the most interesting ones are the poem of the righteous sufferer. That's a Mesopotamian poem that predates the book of Job by several centuries. There's the Testament of Job, which is a later Jewish reworking of the canonical book of Job. And there's also the story of Ayub, which is the Islamic version of the book of Job. And information on all of those can be found in the supplementary file to this week's topic, so nothing further needs to be said about them here. So let's return to the canonical book of Job. We've already seen a quick sketch, but now we need to look again and draw out some of the detail. One of the first things we're told is that Job was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. And this is important. It tells us right from the outset that Job is innocent and hasn't done anything to deserve the bad things that are going to happen to him. We're also told that Job has 7 sons, 3 daughters, thousands of sheep and camels and oxen and so on, which made him the wealthiest man in the East. But all this is about to change. We then learn that God is very pleased with Job, who is after all blameless, upright and God-fearing. God points all of this out to another divine being who is identified only as the adversary. You'll find in some translations that this is identified as Satan, but in the original it's not. Now the adversary points out that it's hardly surprising that Job is upright and God-fearing because he's had a charmed life under God's protection. The adversary then suggests that if all Job has were taken away from him, he would surely curse God. Now whether this is a prediction, a challenge, or perhaps even a wager is unclear. Either way, God allows the adversary to take everything from Job. The only restriction is that Job himself is not to be harmed. In a heartbeat, Job's livestock are destroyed and his sons and daughters are killed. Job is distraught, but doesn't curse God. Feeling thwarted, the adversary goes back to God and suggests that if he were allowed to cause Job physical harm, then Job would surely curse God. Again, whether this is a prediction, a challenge, or a wager isn't clear. In any case, God grants the adversary permission to cause Job physical harm. The only restriction now is that Job must not be killed. The adversary agrees, and Job quickly finds himself inflamed from head to toe, but still he doesn't curse God. After this, no more is heard about the adversary. But now 3 of Job's friends arrive to console and comfort him, although as it turns out they'll end up doing the exact opposite. The friends are Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar. Job gives them a speech in which he curses the day of his birth, though he again doesn't curse God. And then there follows 3 rounds of speeches in which each friend tries to explain why Job finds himself in this predicament. And Job responds each time. In the first round of speeches, Eliphaz begins by insinuating that since Job is suffering, he therefore must have sinned. And that clearly reflects the orthodox Jewish explanation for suffering that we encountered earlier, suffering as punishment. Job does not respond directly to what Eliphaz has said, and instead just vents about his predicament before opting for a new policy of directly complaining about God to God. Bildad then speaks, insisting that God is just and suggesting that therefore Job can expect a future reward for his sufferings, if he is indeed as blameless and upright as he claims. It's important to note here that there is no hint whatsoever here of a reward in an afterlife. Anyway, in his reply, Job does not respond to what Bildad has said and instead demands a trial with God so that he can clear his name. Lastly, Zophar speaks. He talks of God's depths and our inability to know them. God is quite literally inscrutable to us. In response, Job continues his complaint and insists on pleading his case directly to God. And that brings the first round of speeches and replies to an end. The second round of speeches builds on the first, with positions becoming more entrenched. Eliphaz attacks Job's attitude, his challenges to God, his defiance of God, again insisting that Job must be guilty since he's suffering. Eliphaz can just see no other explanation for it. And Job admits he would be saying the same thing to his friends if the situation were reversed and they were the ones suffering. But of course, he knows that in his own case, he isn't guilty at all. The remaining exchanges of the second round don't lead to any progress. Job's friends insist on giving stock theological answers for his suffering, while Job just dismisses them all. He complains that under God's watch, injustice is common. Bad people live long lives and prosper, while good people die without ever having known happiness. The third round of speeches offer more of the same. Job's friends insist it cannot possibly be the case that he is right and God is wrong, so he must be wicked to deserve his sufferings. In a lengthy response, Job insists time and again that he is right and continues complaining about God and to God. Crucially, in all of this, he never curses God, although he surely comes quite close. After Job finishes speaking, a fourth character, Elihu, offers his own lengthy reflections, which end with him pleading with Job to consider the marvels of God's creations. Once Elihu has finished talking, Job finally gets what he's been asking for: an appearance from God. Or at least from God's voice, which comes out of a whirlwind. What happens next? Well, does Job get an explanation for his suffering? No. Does he get to state his case in front of God? No. Instead, God reels off a series of questions in what one writer has nicely described as a cosmic put-down. The questions start with God saying, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations?" And God then reels off a list of things under divine command: the sea, the snow, the clouds, the seasons, the stars, as well as animals, and in each case asking Job if he too can command them, or can even truly understand them in all their depth and mystery. All Job says in reply is that he cannot answer, and so will not speak. And this prompts God into another monologue about the wonders of creation, all things far beyond Job's limited grasp. When God finishes, Job is humbled. He tells God, "I know that you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible for you. Indeed, I spoke without understanding of things beyond me, which I did not know." Job then recants and relents. In other words, he withdraws his criticisms and changes his mind. In a final flourish, God criticizes Job's friends and praises Job. The friends are criticized for not telling the truth about God, in contrast with Job, who did. And that's pretty significant. Clearly, God is saying that the explanations the three friends came up with to explain Job's sufferings are wrong, and the three friends didn't know what they were talking about. But is the point that they happened to get it wrong on this particular occasion? Or is there a broader point that humans just shouldn't try to explain suffering because they're out of their depth? Anyway, to conclude the story, after praising Job and criticizing his friends, God restores Job's fortunes. In fact, doubles them, and before long, Job has another 7 sons and another 3 daughters. And after all of this, the book tells us that Job lived for another 140 years and then died old and contented. Now, all I've done here is outline some of the main points of the book of Job, but hopefully it's clear from the outline that there is a lot of depth to the story, a lot to think about. Hopefully it's also clear that the book offers more questions than answers. How are we supposed to interpret what happens? Does the book have a message, a moral we're supposed to draw about suffering? Perhaps more than one message. Does the story show that it is acceptable, even righteous, to challenge God? Or does it show that we're presumptuous to challenge God, given the vast difference in power and wisdom between us and God? In which case, should we just be humble before God, accept our limitations, and not complain? And what morals should we draw about suffering? That suffering will ultimately be rewarded? That suffering is inexplicable or pointless? That God inflicts suffering on a whim? Or that we just can't understand why people suffer? As the questions multiply, so do the possible answers. And Jewish thinkers see in the book of Job a rich source of ideas about suffering. Many of them think the book does contain a message. Some of them think it even contains an explanation for suffering, but they disagree about what this message or explanation is. In our remaining time in this segment, we'll look at how one influential Jewish philosopher explained Job's suffering. And that philosopher is Maimonides, who is to Jewish philosophy what Augustine or Aquinas is to Christian philosophy. Maimonides considers the story of Job in his book called The Guide of the Perplexed. Straight away, Maimonides spots something in the story of Job that he takes to be significant. Namely, that Job is only ever said to be virtuous or upright, never wise or intelligent. Now, at first glance, this might not seem to be particularly important. We might feel that what really matters is that Job is clearly a moral person, and for that reason doesn't deserve what happens to him. If so, we probably think that whether he was wise or not is neither here nor there. But Maimonides disagrees. Why? Well, the answer is to be found in the way Maimonides understands the distribution of God's providence. Providence is God's guardianship or protective care over individuals, or entire species, or even the entire universe. With regard to us humans, the traditional view was that providence is directed at those with good deeds. So God shows concern for the virtuous. That's the traditional view. But Maimonides takes a different line. He claims that providence is directed towards those with intellect. The intellect being the most godlike part of us. Now we might think that this means that every human being will benefit from God's providence because every human being has an intellect. But Maimonides does not agree. For him, merely possessing an intellect is not enough to fall under God's providence. For that to happen, we have to take steps to develop or cultivate our intellect. So what Maimonides is saying is that God's protection or concern is reserved for those who have developed their intellect to some extent. And you'll be interested to know that he thinks this happens through philosophical training. So you've picked the right course. Now, those who haven't developed their intellect in this way simply fall outside of God's providence. That's Maimonides' view. So we can now see why Maimonides thought it's so significant that Job is described as virtuous or upright, but not as wise. Because what this means for Maimonides is that as Job lacked wisdom, he also lacked God's providence. Yes, Job was virtuous and upright, but those things offer no protection at all. This might go some way towards explaining why Job found himself in the predicament that he did. Not being wise, he lacked God's protection. Okay, but what do we make of Maimonides' remark that if he were wise, he would not have had any doubts about the cause of his suffering? Well, to understand what this means, Maimonides directs us to the end of the Job story, where God has spoken and Job declares that he now has a knowledge of God which he didn't have before. Maimonides points out that what Job is admitting here is that before God appeared and spoke to him, he knew God only by tradition, in the same way religious people generally know God. But as soon as he acquired a true knowledge of God, he realized that true happiness consisted in that knowledge, and that no misfortune could ever take it away. Maimonides goes on to say that so long as Job's knowledge of God was based on tradition, He thought that health, wealth, and children were the highest goods attainable. And that's why he was so unhappy when they were taken away. Now, this is revealing. What Maimonides is saying is that if Job had been truly wise from the start, he would have realized that the true source of happiness is not health, wealth, or children, but rather a knowledge of God that comes through wisdom or philosophy. So what happens at the end of the story is that Job finally attains knowledge of God through wisdom. And since he now knows that this is the true source of happiness, he withdraws his complaint against God. And of course, now that Job has wisdom, it means he now falls under God's providence, which explains why his health and wealth are restored. In fact, more than restored, and he's blessed with children all over again. So this then is the interpretation of Job given by Maimonides. I should stress that it's only one of very many interpretations out there. Other ones are quite different from that. But if nothing else, it does give an indication of the depth of the Job story, and it shows how it's possible to make sense of it.